All right, here we go. Thanks for joining, John. So how are things going?
Well, it's a fascinating time, right? We get into a period of the year where things kind of slow down from a travel standpoint, but there's just so much happening, and so it's interesting. But yeah, it's good to be with you today to have more of a unstructured shoot the shit conversation. I'm really happy about this format, so should be
Yeah,
cool.
same here. I mean, we internally have a lot of these discussions almost on a daily basis because the market is shifting weekly, if not daily, and it's fascinating to see how things are changing every week these days.
Yeah, yeah.
One thing I mentioned internally is there is always discussion about, hey, what are we doing here, what are we doing there, and all of that, and there is always debate and discussion about, hey, here are the winners. But I step back and say, the winners will change next week, because at least the analogy I would like to use is, when the ground underneath is shaking, you can't really build a house. And because the landscape keeps changing and the technology landscape is changing almost on a weekly basis, so you cannot build a product, you cannot build a business or a business model here. So the winners really aren't really defined, and it needs a stability, like the ground stability, to build a house. So even if you're building a new product, there has to be some kind of a stability, and today the market does not have that stability. And I often think about, hey, how do you achieve that stability? How did things stabilize in the previous eras? And I remember the dot-com days. Well, the bubble had to burst before the stability came in. I'm seeing some parallels here, where obviously we are in bubble in pockets, and it has to burst at some point for the stability to come in, and then the reality will come out. I keep telling internally, where we shipped our first web application in around, say, 2000-ish, but it took us a decade or so for it to really become a real business and a business model, for real applications to come out in mass, and a lot of technologies had to be in place. Remember, there used to be JavaScript had to come in, Ajax had to come in, HTML5 on all of these, and then the applications themselves became real, so that people now started putting their credit card on there. I'm seeing a similar pattern here. The initial set of ChatGPT was the initial, like a version of a web app, and slowly reasoning had to come in, context had to window had to increase, agents and tool calling had to come in. So we are seeing this progression, but I'm also noticing that a lot of investment is going in assuming immediate results. And if you understand the history, which we do, it doesn't play out that way. Sometimes you got to let it play out. What are you seeing?
Gosh, I mean, there's a whole lot to digest there. I mean, I think I might question a little bit whether we're going to see stability in a conventional sense again. I just think that there's just so much big picture stuff going on geopolitically, and when you look at everything from climate to just generally scarcity of important resources and how that gets dealt with, and weather disrupts in supply chain. I think instability to me is potentially a little bit of a constant going forward. But what I hold out some hope for is that we develop much more resilient approaches to managing that than we currently have. That, to me, that's what I get excited about, kind of like, rather than like hoping for a return to conditions that I'm not sure we're going to see. But one thing I did want to throw out to you is there's another dynamic that I care a lot about, which is the tension between centralized and decentralized technologies and how to find the right balance there. Because I feel like the trend we've had for a long time now is just the over centralization of technology around the handful of big players that kind of dictate terms to markets, and that's not a comfortable place personally I don't like living in a world where a handful of people make decisions, but I also don't think it's healthy from a technology innovation perspective. And like, so for example, go back to the early web days. Like one thing that I got really excited about was, okay, there were some dominant players that emerged, like the Amazons of the world, but there was in the earlier web there was so much more of an opportunity for niche players to connect with niche services all over the world. I did that in publishing. I sold books all over the place, and I had a visibility even on these big platforms, and people would come to obscure blogging websites, and we'd make connections. And I thought that decentralized versus centralized thing was really cool, and there was sort of tensions, but there were both, and there were options. And I think finally we're seeing, I think with AI, some growing realization that the over centralization of these technologies isn't healthy. It's not sustainable. And I think people are starting to realize, wait, like we can cut our quote unquote addiction to some of these large companies and more appropriate these tools for our own purposes. And I think that's an overdue conversation because honestly, the centralization predates AI. It goes back into hyperscaler land and the move to the cloud, right? And I know you all have talked a lot about these things, and so to me, I thought of you the other day when all this stuff has been happening with everything from the U.S. government banning Mythos and all the fallout from that and the tokenomics. Because earlier last year, when you brought up like what happens when someone unplugs your in quote unquote intelligence, and I think now we kind of have those shockwaves of like, oh crap, this can really happen. But the good news part of it is, I think, quote unquote, the tools and the stack that you might need to run this yourself is starting to feel a little bit more within reach of more, maybe not within everyone, but within more. And I think that's kind of exciting. So I think we're at an interesting turning point.
Yeah, that's a good point. In fact, that decentralization is a trend I suspect we will see. We have seen the centralization with the IBM mainframe, and then we have decentralized with the advent of PC. Now SaaS and cloud compute, we have centralized again, and now with intelligence, I think people will. It's a realization. It's hitting a point where the need for decentralization is there. Recently I was having a discussion with few government officials in a different country, and they are asking the question, "Hey, where's your data? Is it in the country?" I said, "Yeah, it's in the country." But I told them, "You're asking the wrong question. Uh, in the age of intelligence, that is wrong question. It may be the right question in a different world, but now in the age of intelligence, it's a wrong question." Or I gave them an analogy. Think of the data that you have about your citizens and all of them as a book. The book is, you're saying the book has to be within the country. Yeah, the book is in the country, but somebody else is coming in and call the model, reading the book and leaving the room, leaving the country. Yeah, book is in the country, the knowledge left the room. So now this is a different world here, and nobody is questioning, are we losing the knowledge? Let's say, imagine that book had your Coke and that book has your recipe. Sure, the recipe is in your locker, but somebody read the recipe and walked out of the room. As a business, your intelligence left the room, and now are you fine with this central aspect? And there is
Right.
that distinction that not a lot of people are asking, and slowly we are educating them to realize it, that the knowledge is walking out of the room. Your IP intelligence is walking out of the room, and now are you thinking about it? And I'm seeing some companies take ownership of it. They're realizing it. They're saying we are not connecting all of our data, into these central models and let our IP walk away. So instead, they are taking control, and now they are deploying their own models. And now I'm seeing the advent of on-premise models that they control with their IP, with their intelligence in there, and now they are working against it. So we are still in the very, very early stages. I'm seeing some scenarios here and there, but the decentralization is coming because data residing is one, but intelligence residence becomes a critical point now. And what are you as a company or a country if your intelligence walks out the door?
Yeah, I love it. I have 2 points that come up here. One of them is shorter. One of them will take a while to unravel. But let me start with the shorter one, which is I think you really went after something important here. That a true sovereignty discussion is very holistic. It's not just a question of where does my data reside. One really interesting example of that, I've been following a bunch of sovereignty debates going on in Europe because there was a Europe 2031 report that came out that was kind of a hypothetical that caused a lot of viral discussions around sovereignty. And one of the interesting debates around it came up with a company called DeepL, which is based in Cologne, Germany, but they're an AI translation platform that is very Eurocentric. They have 24 official EU languages in there and a bunch of advanced features around voice translation supporting 100 languages. But recently they formed a cloud infrastructure partnership with AWS. And so that caused a lot of controversy and debate inside of Europe because it's like, well, wait, like like how sovereign are we at this moment in time, right? We have all this, an AI centric company in Europe, but it's doing business with a US hyperscaler. And personally, I think that's healthy. Now, you might decide that you would do business with a larger global player, but just the starting with the awareness that there's all different components to the stack that can affect our sovereignty, I think is huge. But the longer discussion is really about intelligence itself, because the idea that intelligence is linked to frontier models to me is a highly open question. In fact, what we've seen is that scale of frontier models is yielding diminishing returns in terms of what intelligence actually looks like. And I would argue in particular, like the future of cognitive systems lies outside of LLMs. And so this is really important because if you assume that a handful of frontier models are the only way forward for intelligence, then you really are screwed with a centralization paradigm. But I kind of reject that, and I would point to one data point on that, which is Google itself just recently came out with a playbook that said 90% of the results you get out of a model are based on the context and the harness, not the model itself. This is a really potentially exciting realization because it means, and I know you all have played around it with a ton of stuff on right-sizing models, so you have a lot of first-hand experience here. And, finding the right models for different purposes takes work, but it's also very liberating work, in my opinion, because it starts to call into question, wait, maybe we don't need to have a total addiction to a handful of companies that have these 1.5 trillion parameter models or whatever. No one knows the parameters of the latest Anthropic models yet, but the point is it's in the trillions. But do you really need that? No, maybe you think you need that if you're going after artificial general intelligence, but for enterprise use cases, I reject that you need that most of the time. Now, we could talk very specifically about what different size models are good for, but the point is, we're entering into a more interesting conversation in my mind, because now, to your point around exporting intelligence, maybe you don't have to do that, because maybe you can actually use an open source model that's viable in your region, or work with a company like yours to customize a local model. To me, that's just so much more energizing for companies, and the big players are starting to do that. Like the Ciscos of the world just came out the last couple of weeks that they're building their own stuff in-house, and blame tokenomics for that. But look, if you're going to be a big AI company and say that your models are really dangerous and that you have to keep raising your prices, well, then you're going to get blowback, and it turns out the blowback is really opening new doors for people.
I mean, that's a good point. I mean, let's zoom into that. We'll come back to your first point maybe later. I'm looking at it strategically, and why is that blowback? Because you have, say, two or three or four model companies that have these trillion plus parameter foundational models, and they're saying we're gonna, apps are gonna be a commodity or whatever, right? I look at this entire, say, AI stack. You have the hardware, you have the cloud computing, let's say, there is a model, and then let's say there are apps and services. If you look at the model, which is in the middle, the model companies are saying, hey, we're going to build our own data centers, so we're going to build our own cloud. And now, so by doing that, model companies say, hey, model is where the value is and the cloud is a commodity. That's the angle that they push. Because as a model company, they want to accrue the value. Now the cloud companies are going to push back and say, hey, okay, we want to accrue the value in the cloud level, So we're going to embrace open source and commoditize the model. So there is a battle between the cloud companies and the model companies.
Yep.
The same thing is playing out at the hardware level. You have the NVIDIAs of the world who are at the hardware level, and obviously model companies are trying to create their own hardware, and they're investing in that level. And the hardware companies like NVIDIA and say, we think the value is in the hardware and not the model. So it is a battle between the hardware companies trying to commoditize the model and the model companies trying to commoditize the hardware. And there are a lot of incentives aligned here, like it's not just Nvidia. Apple is a hardware company, and they have very good hardware, and it is in their interest to commoditize the model. Similarly, a lot of hardware companies are from, say, South Korea or China. It is in their interest to commoditize the model, and that's why some of these Chinese models are open source. I mean, that is downstream of the models themselves. But if you go one level above, if you look at the apps companies, there are about, let's say, 30,000 SaaS companies out there. And the model companies are saying, hey, we're going to commoditize the apps. And the SaaS companies will say, actually, we'll do the other way around. We'll commoditize the models instead. So that's why some of them are embracing the open source models. And the same thing is happening at the service layer too, because these model companies have to go after services because that is a 2 trillion market or so to justify all of these investments. So they're saying, okay, we're going to have a services arm here trying to commoditize and at least extract value out of it. And all the services companies will say, okay, we'll reverse it and say we'll commoditize a model, take the open source models and customize it and all of that. If you look at it, at least the way I look at it, the entire ecosystem at every level of the stack is incentivized to commoditize the model, except the model companies
Yep.
themselves are trying to push back. So now, and that is the entire tech industry is now turning against the model companies. And now they're saying, push this towards the edge. And that is part of the decentralization point you're mentioning earlier. It is in everyone's interest to decentralize it to make sure that the model companies are not taking that over because they need to justify taking over some of these investments because this year it's hitting about 700 billion in capex investment in the AI. The entire SaaS industry is only about 500 billion. You have to get into services and several others to even justify these investments. Obviously, these are over-invested, and
Yeah.
and we're going to see some pullback. So I think if you look at the dynamics, the way I'm seeing it, it is in the industry's interest to push back against these centralized models. And to your other point, where higher context doesn't require a large model. If you have very good context and with right harness, then a small model will do a very, very good job. And I see these models moving towards the edge increasingly as well. And that we are already seeing. If you
Yep.
look at some of the Apple's thing, I think they have come up with a model that runs on the phone. If for extended things you can always use their private cloud, and then from there you can connect to any third party. So what you're saying is right, where we don't need a larger model. We are seeing them shrink and contextualize, and it is in the entire industry's interest for it to decentralize, and each one wants to capture the value.
Yeah. So wow, there's so much good stuff there. I mean, it's really interesting because I'm a big geek about intelligence as a field and what it means, and I could have a long discussion with you about like why I don't think LLMs are the path to true cognitive systems, or if they are, they're just a small piece. Their language is just a small part of what intelligence actually is. Like I watch a lot of animal intelligence stuff, documentaries and things, and the things I see animals do on these documentaries, like watching a fox family raise their little foxes and stuff. All the thought that goes into how they deal with predators, how they when they go to the nest, when they go to the lair, how do they distribute the babies? Where do they get the food from? Like it's all very adaptive, and language models really aren't in that way. But but we could have a debate about that though because people land on different sides of it. But what I don't think is open to debate is large language models are not fit for enterprise purpose, and I'll tell you why. first of all, they're incredibly insensitive to train, and once they're trained, they're essentially fairly static. And enterprises are not static. They need to make decisions based on all kinds of criteria that are changing all the time. Language models are not equipped to do that on their own. The way that we do that, for example, with web search, is we bring in real-time context to help the model understand what's happening now, which is not the same as ground truth, but it's a way of trying to influence the model to help it see, hey, this is actually what's happening now because it's not in your training set. So if we're working on that context anyway, we're kind of exposing the weakness in the model. And I was listening to a really interesting podcast with a UK-based firm that's trying to build a frontier model based in the UK, which is great from a sovereignty perspective. It's called Cosine. But what I thought was really interesting is this discussion, because the CEO was acknowledging that these models aren't very good at generalizing. So how do you solve that? He said, well, we're going to train on every domain. Like, we're going to train on healthcare. We're going to train on, okay, that's fine. But here's the problem in an enterprise context. It's not just real-time data that you need. You also need a much higher degree of explainability and visibility, which models can't give you. So if you ask a model to give you some healthcare information, it really can't adequately source where that information came from. That's an absolute deal breaker for healthcare-based industry scenarios. And the same is true for many regulated fields, right? And so, well, how do you solve that? You solve that through context, because when you supply the language model, which might not even need to be trained on healthcare, the context that you have on healthcare from your harness and from your context architecture, then not only are you providing it with that information, but you can show the customer, the user, where that information was sourced from in their system, or whatever legal documents that you're pulling from some legal knowledge graph. You can source it, you can maintain it, you can update it. You can't do that with a model. And so that's why when you say they're declaring war on the models, one of the reasons is the models aren't fit for enterprise purpose. Remember, these models weren't built to solve enterprise problems, these frontier models. They were built as an attempt to see if we could get to artificial general intelligence. That's why they were built. Now, the big problem with my whole argument and what I worry about is that while I'm energized by the prospect of people creating more decentralized and autonomized versions of this for their own industries and use cases, I worry about the macroeconomic fallout as these models fall short of their intended task. Because as people pull back those investments, like, these models are struggling with profitability anyway. So I don't know how the macroeconomic dominoes are going to fall. I worry about that. But the one thing I do like, though, is that AI is not blockchain and it's not metaverse. It's a real thing. And so some of the investments we're making in infrastructure and data and all of that are going to be there and pay off in some capacity, I think. So,
Although the timeline of that payoff might vary, and
right.
I,
There
I,
might be
I
some
have.
storm clouds ahead, basically.
Well, we've
Yeah.
seen this in the previous such investment cycles, right? Particularly .com is one such case where the companies that made the investments were not around to reap the benefits, but eventually it got used.
Right.
The fiber optic lines were got used. We've
Exactly.
seen that all the way during the railroad investments. We put a lot
Yep.
of investment laying down the rail, but it's not those companies that benefited down the lane. Eventually, that demand was fulfilled.
If you can withstand the market contractions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I suspect that is what we'll end up seeing here. There will be
Yep.
a lot of companies that are putting in capex may not see the immediate returns, but the benefits of AI will be delivered. It may take a decade or so,
Right.
but they
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah.
will be
I agree with that.
delivered.
Yeah.
Yeah. The timeline portion, because the economics simply, or numbers simply don't add up. That 700 billion investment on a yearly basis, those numbers, that's larger than the SaaS market, and as one example. And or if you just go on a pharmaceutical market, it's about a half a trillion or so. Those are big numbers, and what percentage of that market should each of these companies capture to get the ROI here?
Yep. Yeah, but you know what I mean, though, about the fit for purpose part. These weren't designed for enterprise use cases, and like, I just saw an interesting survey of finance executives where they were asked, like, if they said they wouldn't even use models that were 99% accurate if they couldn't have visibility into why the model made the decisions that they made. And LLMs are not equipped to do that. The reasoning traces kind of tell you what they did, but it's been shown that they make that stuff up half the time when they try to explain what they just did. You can't source it that way. The only way you can source it is through a contextual architecture. That's the only way you can do it. And so this is why these model companies, I think, are going to have trouble. Now, granted, the coding domain is different, and I do think the frontier model companies are going to be very successful in the code generation space. But even then, they're actually employing what you might call neurosymbolic techniques, which is a fancy way of saying combining language models with systems of verification and truth to make sure that the output from that code is of higher quality than the original. And you can do that in a variety of ways, including cross-checking work from agents and putting it through verification systems and stuff like that. Because coding has such predictable syntax, I do think the inroads they're making with coding apply greatly, but I don't see that translating as well to other industry domains. And as a result, I think there's tremendous opportunities right now. So it's just a very strange time, because you could look at the headlines and be like, oh crap, like we are really screwed. But then you look at it more closely and you're like, wait, I can run this LLM on my laptop now? Like I can, what use cases does that open up for me and my customers? When I have control not just of my data, but as you said, your intelligence, if you want to call it that, or what happens when I have that whole stack in my office? And it can be done now. I mean, not with the best models, but it can be done.
Yeah, I think the key point you mentioned about coding, and the key word really is verification. One of the reasons LLMs are succeeding in coding is because you can verify, because the code it generates,
Right.
either it compiles or it
Yep.
doesn't. And the timeline of that verification is really, really small.
Yep.
Now, let's say it generates marketing copy. To verify whether that marketing copy worked or not, it'll take a few months. So you cannot prove immediately.
Yep.
Or let's say it spits out a strategy document. Whether the strategy works or not, it takes several quarters to several years. The verifiability, the cycle is much longer there. So that's why the provability aspect isn't there. So that's where the immediate impact of some of these LLMs I see is really in domains where you can quickly verify and there's a structure to it. If you want the LLM to
Mathematics and physics are the others where you have the same rules-based verifications. Yep.
absolutely, and those are the domains that I think will likely see those implications
Yep.
and its implementation part. It typically happens where when you have a new technology, you want to apply the technology in every domain, and all of a sudden that becomes it's like you have a hammer. Now you're going to use that in every case, just because there is this model or this new ingredient. You will end up making a lot of dishes with that ingredient, forgetting that that is one ingredient, and applying that in the apt way for the right recipe is the thing. I think during the bubble phase, it is not clear, but that clarity will evolve. And in this case, verifiability is being one of the key aspects, and it has very good use cases in the context of coding. But in other cases, that is where, going back to your previous point on context, that plays a significantly important role. And I've been doing some experiments myself on the context and building that entire context layer and see how that helps. And then I realize that you don't really need a bigger model. A smaller model will do that, because the context is the one
Yep.
that is playing a significant role here. And that means you shrink that and into a smaller model and push it to the edge.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating, I think, is when we can throw back all the obsession with duplicating human work in an automation frame and start asking, what is the art of the possible here? Like, how could we rethink what we're doing in interesting and exciting ways? I think of it kind of like a flow state, because when you start using these tools, the light bulbs start to go off. Wait, maybe we could use it like this. Maybe we could use it like that. Maybe we could use it to change this process. And to me, that's the energizing part of any technology, including AI, not just AI, is getting into that flow. And I would just love to see more companies getting into that versus like, oh, let's automate our level one service. And it's like, okay. And this gets back to my what kind of AI do you want question, which is, do you want to provide shitty service that angers your customers? Or do you want to rethink service entirely, armed with a new tool, but also with sophisticated human representatives, and figure out what the best balance and what the best mix is? And maybe your goal would not be let's just get rid of a bunch of people, but maybe your goal would be what if we have the best service in our industry? What if our CSAT scores went up? And what if we were efficient from a talent perspective, but we weren't focused on grinding people into dust? I mean, this is the what kind of AI do you want thing in a nutshell, which is, do you just want hyper productive people that are always looking over their shoulders that they could be replaced? Or do you want people that find genuine fulfillment in their jobs, armed with new tools that can help them do their job even better? And I really push companies to start making choices on that, because if you don't, it kind of happens to you. And I think the efficiency automation frame is just, I think, been so limiting in terms of what's possible. And I hope that in the years to come, companies like yours can spark a different kind of conversation. Because, yeah, efficiency is part of it, but you really have to look at, do you just want to build surveillance hamster wheels, or do you want to unleash human potential? I mean, this is my question.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm noticing is the value of the human is going up big time with
Right.
AI. And I mean, I have see, I ended up creating a bunch of agents for myself. I have maybe a dozen or so agents, and instead of me using the software, I'm actually creating the software for the agents to help me. Because I've outsourced some of the work to my agents. The agents use software to do some of the stuff. Now I spend more time talking to people and the human to human interaction, talking to customers, talking to
Yeah.
partners. And it is the agents that are doing all the chores, the drudgery work for me. And that is giving me more time, more face time with my customers. That I certainly see the value there. And the agent started helping me because I gave it the context. It knows everything
Yeah.
about me, and the way I've designed my agents is slightly different. And interestingly, to your previous point, I have all of these agents sitting in my computer at home, where I own the context. No LLM has any of the
Right.
idea, and I've defined all of it, right? And they're doing the work for me. Again, model and in any cases, if I need a model, I'll train a small model for it and then and deploy it. But increasingly, I see the agents as the interface between the human and the software. Instead of humans spending more time with the software, humans spend more time with other humans and let the agents use the software to help the human. That is at least my own pattern
Yeah.
on how I'm seeing it evolve internally.
Yeah, and that's so cool, right? Because, whether you want to call it a flow state or not, like, you got into kind of a creative usage of the tools to apply to your own workflow patterns with the goal of serving your customers better, and having a more fulfilling experience as a human worker in your company, right? And I think the question becomes, how do we cultivate that for teams as well inside of companies, and create team-based collaborations around that? And we're starting to see more of this. Like, I documented one vendor where, skills is becoming a thing, right? Which is essentially providing, I sometimes call it building cool, well-governed things, but empowering people to build cool AI skills and routines that they can share with their colleagues. But they're all built on the same governance framework, right? So it's not just like, oh, I built something at home, but how would it work with the privacy and authorizations of my workplace? No, instead, like, and this is one reason why I think this whole thing around SaaS is dead, is such crap, is because SaaS vendors are uniquely positioned, I think, to help companies and teams with these kinds of things. Like, let's build a skills environment, and then you can start sharing. And this one thing I saw, there's like, yeah, we have like 50 skills we've shared, and okay, they have an approval process before it gets cultivated and stuff. But now people are like, hey, use this one. This one will analyze every meeting you have this week and give you an agenda. This one will analyze all your competitors and tell you what they're doing on a given day. And you start building all these cool things. And I'm like, to me, like, now we're having an energizing conversation about
Yeah.
AI.
and that is the thing I'm noticing. Earlier to create something, say an application or something like that, you'll need developers. That's why probably about 15 million to 20 million developers out there in the world. But now anyone who is an Excel user, probably a billion of them, and all of them can create this. Now unleash the creative energy to create the technology to do the job, and you focus on the human aspects of it.
Yeah,
And
love that.
that is the exciting part for us. It kind of opens up so many possibilities.
Are you
We
seeing that
obviously,
are you seeing that internally as well in your teams?
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
yesterday I was looking at some of the demos that of some of the applications some of our employees created. I was blown away. I did not realize that there is a need for it, and it is encouraging to see a lot of people, even non-technical people, create some of these applications and turn the problem that would otherwise is annoying into a non-problem, and the technology takes care of it. Now they are spending more time on creative ways. So I see it as a creativity unleash factor, and
Yep.
obviously the tokenomics and all of those have to come to a sane levels, and that's where some of the internal models and local deployments will go a long way. This is the current bubble, and it's just a matter of time.
Yeah, and I think the important thing I would point out is that unleashed creativity you described is like connected to creating a culture where people feel empowered to do that, and they understand how their performance is going to be measured around what they do in a way that feels fair and empowering to them and not negative. Because where we see so too often still is this kind of AI first imposition of you must be, and some of the worst ones are all the leaderboards that went up around who's using the most tokens or whatever, as if that's something to be proud of. Now granted, people have pulled back on that a little bit because it's gotten kind of expensive to encourage that kind. But that's totally the wrong kind of gamification, I think, because it's like, to me, like, why would you try to just say, well, let's maximize that? It's more like, why don't you just build the coolest stuff you possibly can, and we'll give you all the tools you can do. And so if you create the culture where that kind of stuff is encouraged and rewarded, then really good things start to happen. And I'm encouraged because I'm seeing more company leaders articulate a clearer philosophy around how they want to use AI internally. And I think that is so important to all of this, because how you communicate those things is critically important. Because look, I mean, not every company is going to say, like, we're not laying off anybody ever because of the technology or anything like that. It's a matter of how do you create an open line of communication around that, so people aren't looking over their shoulders all the time, and they understand, what's in play here. But my whole thing is like, if you do AI right, you should never have to impose an AI first mandate, because these tools should be so energizing and helpful to people that they're going to want to glom onto them and use them. I mean, only a small percentage of people want to suck at their jobs. I mean, most people want to do their jobs better and create better contributions. So why would you have to impose tools on anyone? If you have to do that, I really wonder how good your tools are.
Yeah. I mean, I've noticed based on my own usage, the number of hours I work significantly went up, partly because I'm not able to manage my expectations. I want to do so many things. The
Yeah.
creativity juices flow, and you end up putting a lot more energy. I haven't been this energized in a long, long time. The last time I did that was when I discovered something called the internet, and now I think we are at a similar phase, and the tokenomics and all of those are, it's a good challenge. And also, it doesn't, if you're a veteran and looking at the industry for multiple decades, how kind of things play out. There are at least an order of magnitude, if not two orders of magnitude, improvements that have to come and will come. Is my gut belief. I don't have a proof there, but I'm seeing some sense of it. I mean, again, look at the basic thing. Like our brain uses about maybe 20 watts of energy. uh, and NVIDIA's single GPU uses about 600, maybe 800 watts of energy. That's a that's a 30x at least inefficiency, right? But a single NVIDIA GPU cannot replicate your brain. You probably need 100 or 1,000 of them,
Exactly.
right? That's a 20 to 30,000x difference. And I look back and say, look at the transistors. In 2 to 3 decades, the transistors improved by 20 to 30,000x. So why can't that happen in the intelligence as well? And I suspect we're going to see that in the next, say, decade or so. And so that is a 2 to 3x, a 2 to 3 fold improvements. And those two orders of magnitude improvements will make the intelligence commodity and then bring it to the edge and available to everyone out there. So we are still in the early phases of the cycle, in my view. And then that'll bring the energy efficiencies by a couple of, well, and that is where all the investments that is happening today ironically will help the next gen models and diffusion to whatnot, but it has to happen, and but the end result is going to be good. Just that, as I mentioned earlier, the current ones investing may not be the ones benefiting from it.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, and I think a lot of the most interesting AI innovators that I study in my research are highly cognizant of human intelligence, and like you said, particularly the energy efficiency of human intelligence is pretty staggering. And the interesting thing too is that our intelligence isn't perfect either. I mean, we have our cognitive biases and our confirmation biases and everything else. So we're both a marvel of intelligence and also very imperfect. And I think that's really interesting because then you can start thinking about, well, how could we build machines that don't just imitate us, but also improve upon areas where we aren't as good, right? One of my favorite things to think about is to change your relationship with the technology. So instead of allowing the typical LLM sycophantic, oh, great idea, the encouragement that it gives you all the time, to turn it around and turn it into a sparring partner and say, what's wrong with my business plan? What's wrong with my article? What's wrong with my thinking about this? It won't volunteer that, but if you push it, it will. And to me, it's all about like, do you want to use these tools to challenge yourself? And the thing I would just say though is I think there's going to be a bit of an AI winter vibe, not necessarily economically. We'll have to see how that plays out. But I think there are going to be some innovation winters I don't think it's going to be this linear progression towards what you're describing. Like, so for example, like, Jan LeCun abandoning LLMs to develop world models. He had to become disillusioned with language models in terms of the realities of the physical world and intelligence he wants to capture in order to pursue something different. Now, how well will that go? We will find out. And then other people are working on world models that are going to be more connected to virtual language models and that technology. So we got different people working on different paths, but I do think they're going to hit some walls. And those walls that's the beauty of science, is you hit those walls and you fall down and then you rethink. My hope is that happens without hurting the economy, because, there should be room for experiments, and then also, like you said, we should be able to live in a world where we're not just worried we're about to go off the cliff. And so hopefully we can have, a stable AI economy, but also people saying like, wait, we got to keep pushing here because, we shouldn't need massive data centers to power single language models. I mean, that's not the path to anywhere.
I agree. I think part of it is again financial. The money is flowing into these data centers, and all of this goes back to all this money is coming from all the money being printed, trillions of dollars being printed during the COVID era, and now they find their way into these
Yep.
investments and all of that, and looking for a higher return. But something has to stabilize before, and during that stabilization period, the investment has to continue in these world models and whatnot, and hopefully we'll see some breakthroughs in that. I'm hopeful on that front.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting when, like, this is such a great time to have a little bit of distance from the bottom line and the pressure of quarterly results, because when you don't have those pressures, you can think more openly. And like, some of the best conversations I've had about AI in the last couple of years have been with folks like yourself. I think of some other conversations I've had with folks like Ram at Zoho, like kind of talking about like, okay, what's different parameter models do different things. Why? What are they good for? What are we learning here? And if we can do that without these intense economic pressures, I think that's really beneficial. Because in the end, what's ironic is that a lot of times when you don't have those pressures, you end up with the most quote unquote game changing inventions in the end. that make the biggest difference. And so I hope we can create a space where we don't feel so much pressure all the time to justify. I mean, the ROI conversation is healthy for companies to have, of course, but don't forget about the experimental sandbox either, because that's where a lot of the really good stuff happens. And in AI, we really need to build those sandboxes, but in a way that is safe for people, so that they know they're not screwing up with IP and posting, intellectual property where they shouldn't. So that we really have to figure out how to create experiments that are safe. And I think if we do that, I really like our direction. I think when we succumb to all the fear-based thinking around crap, we've overinvested and now we have to justify it, that's when I don't like our chances. And so I don't know,
Yeah.
these open conversations are so great because there's so much to talk about right now. Oh my god.
I agree. In fact, that experimentation is the key. Internally, we look at it and say, hey, take all these tokens. A single token, we ask a simple question: how much does it cost to process a single token? It costs about 200 billion flops for a single token. Now we are spending about 200 billion flops. You ask the question, is that the right usage of a flop? Can we improve it by an order of magnitude or a couple of orders of magnitude?
Yeah.
And if you are, then the 100x investment will basically become 1x out there. So that's the two orders of magnitude of savings. And if you look at it at the fundamental level, and we have to do some experiments on all of it, maybe this is the wrong path for certain solutions. Maybe you go down a different path, and that will give you a two orders of magnitude improvement. If you make those adjustments, I think we'll see those significant breakthroughs. We are already seeing a few internally, but I think we are not in the optimization phase yet because the money is flowing. Once the money stops is when we'll think about optimization, improvements, and alternative ways and all of that. That's why I think we are still in the very early stages of the cycle.
One other topic that I love talking about with you all is about I know you're so passionately committed to education, and I am too, and I'm really fascinated by how do we give the next generation that's emerging now how do we tap into their creativity around these technologies, but also help them to advance in a world where they feel like they're seeing less opportunity, and also the dangers of them getting tied into these tools in negative ways. And I talked to my friend Vijay Sankar about that because he manages large teams, and we were talking about this thing that I talked about around helping people to learn how to use LLMs to interrogate their work rather than over trusting the tools and stuff like that. But this fascinating dynamic where the younger generation, because they're so fluid with this technology, often ask the best questions, because they'll come into big companies and be like, why aren't you doing it this way? And VJ's saying, yeah, that's a good point. Why aren't we? Because they're asking the right questions, but then at the same time, they don't have the domain expertise sometimes to recognize the errors and flaws in the output of these technologies. They are not truth machines, even with the best context. And a lot of people don't want to accept that fact, but a decent chunk of the time they're going to revert to their internal knowledge, which is known as the parametric knowledge, even if you provide them with context. And so the point is, you can't trust them all the time, and you have to know how to spot the problems. And anyway, so I think there's this really interesting model that's starting to emerge of how do you create that culture where everyone benefits, where those new ideas get circulated, but you also bring some of the problems of over-trusting technology and not being able to spot the problems and cultivating domain expertise. And so one thing that VJ was talking about was the usage of human mentors as part of that process. So pairing younger developers and younger engineers with domain experts and encouraging them, here's the problems, here's what we see, and then hopefully both sides thrive on those conversations where they're pushing each other. And I don't know what you think, but I think there's a whole lot of interesting cultural opportunities inside of organizations to get this right, but there's also a chance to get it wrong. And we've seen companies not hire junior people anymore, and I think they're really walking down a bad path with that, because you want to embrace this challenge of how do you cultivate talent in a different way.
I, I, I mean, I'm big into mentorship and apprenticeship model, and AI plays right into it, where
Yep.
the once you follow that model, the mentor guides, uses the technology, and now it becomes AI acts as an accelerator for education
Right.
for the kids out there. I was doing it for summer projects with some kids recently. I gave them a project and said, "You're going to build a geodesic dome." Said the first question, what is a geodesic dome? Just look it up, ask an
Yeah.
AI, and we collaboratively do a voice conversation and understand, what is it, like
Yeah.
and then you get into, hey, how can you make it energy efficient? Can you make it self-sustainable? And then go down that path. What would otherwise take, let's say, 3 or 4 days to do the research, you're able to do that in a 20 to 30-minute conversation, but you have to guide it the right way. And the kids may not know what questions to ask. That's where the mentor comes in and guiding it so that they absorb the knowledge. These kids, they're like a sponge. If you feed them the knowledge, they're going to soak it up. You
Yep.
just have to guide them in the right way. And
Right.
that's where I see it as a very, very positive thing, provided there is the right guidance out there. So
Yeah.
again, I'm hoping that the apprenticeship model comes back in this. You don't need a massive scale, but you just a smaller scale, guide them in the right direction, and it can be a massive force here when it comes
So
to education.
do you think of it like we're going to keep hiring, but we're going to train differently, or we're going to kind of look for some different characteristics in who we hire? But I know that Zoho is going to keep hiring young, emerging talent, so that's a given. But how do you think about it in terms of the best way to do that now?
One of the things we are observing, thinking about the kids is they're fearless.
Mm.
They do not know what they do not know. In a lot of cases, they do not know the challenges that they are trying to work on. The solutions are
You don't want
actually
to lose
considered
that.
really big,
Yeah, I
right?
love that. Yeah.
Now you just have to give them the keys and say, hey, go
Mm.
crazy, and but then guide them. I see that the size of the team is really, really small, and increasingly the smaller teams are producing good results.
Mm.
2 to 3 people team, but they are able to execute well under the right guidance. We are having massive luck on that front. So it is the age of creation, and
Mm.
anyone who has that creative mind and curiosity is the key essence here. It's the opportunities are limitless. This is going to be, AI was one of those areas where if you have a creative mind, you can go crazy with the number of things you can create.
Cool. Well, that's heartening to hear. That's what I was kind of hoping you would say, but we haven't talked in a while, so I wasn't sure.
The other discussion I'm seeing really is on the sovereignty side, which is a different angle where, companies, we hear it a little bit, but at the country level, those discussions are coming up and say, hey,
Mm.
intelligence, what is the sovereignty part here, and how do we retain our sovereignty? And there is that part that comes up. And do you see that often from your side? Because I'm seeing that discussion come up increasingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously there was a huge wake up call with everything that happened with Anthropic and the U.S. government, but it's kind of been brewing for a while, even before that, particularly for data, because the regulations in the data space are getting more intense in different companies, and so that has been sparking this already. And I think it's a really healthy discussion for companies, and so much of it I think revolves around like assuming that you don't want to play a black hat role in the world. Like, how do you get people to opt in, and then how do you honor those opt ins? And then sovereignty kind of builds upon that concept of, different regions have different data expectations, and then your whole stack as well. And like, how do you do that? And some of it I think is sovereignty, and some of it is also planning for redundancy because, okay, if you're too sovereign and your whole region goes down, maybe that's not so great either, because now you've placed all eggs in a different basket, and that's not going to go well from a customer access perspective if some, God forbid, something happens that destabilizes your region for a period of time. And so I think it's a very nuanced conversation, but what I do like is that the conversation is happening. And one of the best things about AI is that it forces a data conversation we probably should have been having a long time ago. And now we have renewed momentum to have that conversation, because honestly, like, even smaller companies like really struggle with data silos. And then when they want to do cool things with AI, what they find is they can't do what you did on your desktop, because unlike your desktop, you can just feed in whatever you want. That's not the same when you have different applications running in a corporate situation, right? With different data structures and permissions and all of that. And then you're like, crap, like, until we get all this sorted, and that leads naturally into a sovereignty conversation. And who are you going to trust, and why? And I'm not a purist about it. Like, I'm not going to hold it against companies if they want to do business with a hyperscaler that I might not want to, or I'm not a big Meta fan, for example. But so I would say stay away from Meta personally. But my job is really more to encourage companies to have open conversations about this, not to criticize their choices. And so what I am seeing is more and more open conversations, and we're writing about it a lot on Diginomica. And I think it's healthy, but it can be a little bit overwhelming too. Like, so one of the things we talk about a lot, Raju, is like, what is the next step? Like, how can you give people something manageable they can take home and start using? And so that's always the hardest part of these conversations, because the whiteboard is great and the open conversation is great, but how do you then give people something for next week that they can go take home? And I don't know, a lot of times that has to do with identifying an area where they do have some quality data, or they do have a real pain point that they can see, and maybe start there, because that iterative power of these tools is important. So you got to start somewhere on live data. So find a place, do it. But yeah, in the context of sovereignty, it's kind of like a parallel track. Start small, build wins, but don't ignore the strategic conversation about where you want your data to ultimately reside.
Yeah, certainly. Data is one part. I think this is a conversation will be good to have in a subsequent discussion, because
Yeah.
I've had this conversation with
And
a
it's
lot of
not just
customers,
data,
and
right? Like, data is just
it's not
one
just
piece. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. And I I started asking, hey, are you a customer, or are you a hostage?
Yeah.
And I said, don't tell me the answer, but you just self-analyze and make sure that or it's not a binary thing. Where in that sovereignty spectrum do you fall, and are you comfortable where you are? And that is a
Right.
honest conversation you got to have. And so I think people are starting to recognize it after a few incidents globally. So they're having the conversation, which is good. Anyway, that will be a deeper discussion to have maybe some other time. I
I
didn't
would love
realize
it.
we
I would
almost
love it.
hit an hour. Yeah,
Yeah. Great to
awesome.
kick. Love that. That was so much fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think it's a good discussion. I think we can go on for a couple of hours easily, but I think we'll
Yeah.
call it wrap here, and maybe in a subsequent discussion we'll talk about other topics.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thanks, John.